Hello all. So it's another vlog from myself into ISL, but the first thing I'd like to do is apologize for my last vlog. You know the one I was wearing the red shirt in? Yeah, that one. So I was signing away in that, and after I'd recorded it, I watched it through, put a bit of a voiceover onto it. Once that was done, I had a look at the end result and I said, that's fine. So posted it up to YouTube, Facebook, my blog, all those places. But it's only watching it recently I realized how stupid I was. The frame cut off the top of my head. You know, the frame of the actual shot, it should have been above my head to give my head a little space. But instead it ran right through my forehead. People might have been wondering, what happened to the top half of my head? Are my brains exposed above the frame? Anyway, apologies for that. I have the framing right here for this clip. So what I want to do here is explain a little bit more clearly and clarify something in my last vlog when I talked about institutions. So you might be wondering, well, what kind of institutions am I going to be looking at? So I suppose I'm going to be focusing on 5 kinds of institutions in my research. And by that, I'm going to be talking about state institutions with the links to the government at the time, or private or charity established institutions. And in the 19th century, you had plenty of these new institutions springing up, both state institutions and charity institutions. So I'm going to be talking about 5 categories of institutions. And the first kind of institution is deaf schools, because they were institutions. They were boarding schools where pupils would stay often for years to be educated. They were residential institutions. The second category I'm going to be looking at is the courts. And I suppose they're not the kind of institutions where you'd be a resident for years, but I suppose it's an institution of the state. It's an important way for the government to interact with the people in the country. So I suppose the courts and the law, which is administered through the courts, is an institution in my view, which needs to be looked at. The third institution is the workhouse. So at the time you had people in poverty, people who were starving and in need would often have to enter the workhouse, which, you know, the workhouse's conditions were often terrible and people sometimes were forced to enter them because of life circumstances, and deaf people were in that kind of an institution very often. Then there's prisons, and of course, for the last while I have been lecturing and going around Ireland talking about deaf people in prisons. And then lastly, I'm going to be looking at mental institutions, or mental hospitals, or what was called before then, the old phraseology for them was lunatic asylums. So I'll be looking at those, and deaf people were very much in lunatic asylums in the period I'm looking at. Those are the 5 institutions I'll be focusing on. So at the moment, I mean, 2 weeks ago I became a registered student, so for the foreseeable future, I'll be looking a little bit about being reflexive in my research. I can't divorce myself from my research subject and look at it in that neutral way. I mean, I'm a person, I'm a human being. I am involved as a human being and as a researcher in what I'm researching. I need to look at who I am as a researcher, and I need to interrogate that and ask myself a lot of questions. So maybe it's time for me to briefly explain a little bit and pick a few points about who I am. Not everything, but maybe later on I realize there's important dimensions to who I am I need to add to this list. But for now, maybe to go through some of these, important categories of information. So first of all, my name is Cormac Leonard. That's my sign name there as well. I'm 37 years old. I'm living in Drogheda, which is in the north. Well, I suppose if you take Dublin County and go a little bit north of that, a couple of counties up, that's where Drogheda is. That's where I'm living, but I was born and raised in North County Dublin in a place called Skerries. So I'm hearing. My parents are also hearing, and in my extended family, we're all hearing. There's no deafness. And unfortunately, I've been scouring my family tree, trying to go back as far as I can, hoping to find some kind of a deaf ancestor, but I haven't found any deafness there yet. Maybe one day. So I've been involved in the deaf community and working with the deaf community for about 15 years in different positions, in different areas, even though the relationship with that connection to the deaf community has changed over the years. I started learning sign language out of interest. Then I did a master's thesis focusing on deaf politics. looking at the NAD and the Irish Deaf Society and the conflict that was there. So I had a look at that, investigated that for my thesis. After that, I joined Hands On, the television program for deaf people, who contacted me because they needed a researcher at the time. So I started with them and stayed as researcher in Hands On for 2 years. After Hands On, I moved to the Irish Deaf Society. I worked as a researcher. Oh, sorry, not as a researcher, as an administrator. And I was there for a couple of years. Then after that, I entered the Centre for Deaf Studies for my interpreter training, where they brushed all the bad habits out of me. And then after 2 years of that, I became a qualified interpreter, and I received my diploma. And that was in 2005. So I've been working as a professional interpreter now for 9 years. So those are various aspects of myself, of who I am, of my identity. It's a quick summary, really. It doesn't fully describe everything about Cormac Leonard. You can't really separate a person into those different components and describe them that way, but that's just some of them. So for the next while, I'm going to be looking into this whole area of who am I? Who is the I when I say I am researching this? And there is that relationship between the researcher and the researched, whatever that research subject is. Because obviously I'm going to have biases, I'm going to have baggage, but the things that I have picked up through my upbringing, the values and the influences that I have, and that do come to bear, and that can influence the research process. And also, in terms of the research process and the production of research, what goes into making this thesis, I definitely have to think about power. This is going to be a hugely important topic for me to think about. So I suppose the areas that I've talked about, the aspects of who I am that I've mentioned already, will have to be, I suppose, put under the microscope and subjected to some really in-depth analysis. I'm going to have to dissect all these different parts of me as it relates to my research. So that's what I'm going to be doing for the next few months, I think. So I'm looking forward to it. All right, see you all soon.